In the previous lecture, you may have noticed that the same Buddhist term is spelled and pronounced in two distinct manners. For example, the state that the Buddha entered after his enlightenment or awakening is spelled both nirvana and nibbana. The two different ways of spelling the same term are similar since they come from two dialects of Sanskrit, the ancient language of India. Etymologically, nirvana or nibbana means a blowing out. In Latin, this term translates as despiration, which is never a goal in Christianity since Christians aim at being inspired and filled with the Spirit of God, not blown out. The second spelling is a dialect of Sanskrit called Pali. Pali is used in early Buddhist writings. It is also the liturgical language of the Theravada school of Buddhism. Since this school is not the predominant school of Buddhism, the term nirvana is more frequently used. The most common form of Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism. It is followed by Theravada Buddhism, which is in turn followed by Tibetan Buddhism, also called Vajrayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism predominates in China, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. Theravada Buddhism is mainly present in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Laos, and Cambodia. Tibetan Buddhism is primarily in Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and Mongolia. In 2010, the total number of Buddhists in the world, according to the Pew Research, was around 488 million. And in the lecture transcript, I provide you Pew Research data that is accompanied by a map. And you'll notice if you look at the map, the vast majority of Buddhists are located in Asia. Origin of Buddhist traditions. After Siddhartha Buddha died in around 480 BC, disputes arose over the various aspects that the Buddha deliberately left ambiguous. Councils were convened to settle these disputes. The first was held in 405 BC. The second council was held around 305 BC. Of these two councils, we have more reliable documentation from the second. At the second Buddhist council, or sometime after, a division occurred in Buddhism that some call a great schism. The two main rival groups that were formed as a result of this division were called the Doctrine of the Elders and the Great Community. The two major schools of Buddhism that exist today are successors of these two schools. The Theravada school, primarily in Southeast Asia, is the successor of the Doctrine of the Elders school. The Mahayana school, primarily in North Asia, East Asia, and Vietnam, is the Great Community successor. 16 other schools also arose, but none of these have survived intact. The unclear nature of Buddhist doctrine which gave rise to these divisions were intended by Siddhartha Buddha, as an account from his life in the Sutta Pitaka illustrates. According to this story, one of his disciples by the name of Malonkya-Putta approached the Buddha to ask him doctrinal questions, including whether the universe is eternal, whether the soul and body are the same, and whether after death the Buddha exists. The Buddha dismissed Malonkya-Putta's questioning by comparing it to a man who has been wounded by a poisonous arrow but refuses to allow a surgeon to remove the arrow until he knows who shot him, what he looked like, what the shaft is made of, etc. With this comparison, Buddha taught Malonkya-Putta not to focus on doctrinal questions, but rather to accept the practical solution to suffering that the Buddha had offered to him. If he followed the Buddha's teaching on faith, then his arrow of suffering would be removed. Catholics believe that doctrine does matter and helps to accurately know God so as to better love, glorify, and serve Him. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church clearly states, quote, "Admittedly, in speaking about God like this, our language is using human modes of expression. Nevertheless, it really does attain to God Himself, though unable to express Him in His infinite simplicity." End of quote. Theravada Buddhism. According to the system of Theravada, Way of the Elders Buddhism, the Buddha only provided a good example to follow in order to be freed from suffering, extinguish desire, be awakened, and enter into the state of nirvana. The awakening from this world of illusion can only be obtained by monks and nuns who live out celibacy and commit themselves to a life of intensive study and meditation. Once the Buddha enters into the state of nirvana, he cannot be communicated with. This means that prayers to a spiritually awakened purpose are without purpose. An enlightened person can communicate with the world, or the world communicate with it. An enlightened person cannot communicate with the world, or the world communicate with the enlightened person. It's not possible, since according to Theravada Buddhism, such a person has realized the Buddhist doctrine of no self called anatta. Therefore, there's no self to communicate with or to. This doctrine maintains that nothing has any permanent nature, identity, I, or self. As recorded by Stephen Collins, the highly respected and well-educated Theravada Buddhist monk Rahula explains the doctrine of an anatta as follows, and I quote, "What in general is suggested by soul, self, ego, or to use the Sanskrit expression Atman, is that in man there is a permanent, everlasting, and absolute entity, which is the unchanging substance behind the changing phenomenal world. According to some religions, each individual has such a separate soul which is created by God, and which, finally after death, lives eternally either in hell or heaven, its destiny depending on the judgment of its creator. According to others, it goes through many lives till it is completely purified and becomes finally united with God or Brahman, universal soul or Atman, from which it originally emanated. This soul or self in man is the thinker of thoughts, feeler of sensations, and receiver of rewards and punishments for all its actions, good or bad. Such a conception is called the ideal of self. Buddhism stands unique in the history of human thought in denying the existence of such a soul, self, or Atman. According to the teaching of the Buddha, the idea of self is an imaginary, false belief which has no corresponding reality and produces harmful thoughts of me and mine, selfish desire, craving, attachments, hatred, ill will, conceit, pride, egotism, and other defilements, impurities, and problems. It is the source of all problems in the world, from personal conflicts to wars between nations. In short, to this false self can be traced all the evil in the world." The radical insistence that nothing has an enduring self raises the question of whether the doctrine of anatta contradicts the doctrine of reincarnation. For in order for something to be reincarnated, there must be some type of continuity from one existence to the next. As Malcolm David Eckel pithily asks, quote, "If there is no self, what is reborn?" End of quote. And that's based, of course, on nothing comes from nothing. The Theravada school's response is, explains Eckel, quote, "The stream or flame of consciousness is reborn. Because of the causal continuity between moments in the flame, it is possible to say that I am the same person from one moment to the next." End of quote. In other words, while denying with the doctrine of anatta that there is any permanent self, the Theravada schools at the same time affirm that there is a personality that is defined by the causal relationship of one moment to the next. The Catholic position teaches the Catechism of the Catholic Church is, quote, "that every spiritual soul is created immediately by God, is not produced by the parents, and also that it is immortal. It does not perish when it separates from the body at death, and it will be reunited with the body at the final resurrection." End of quote. Mahayana Buddhism. As explained earlier, the Mahayana school of Buddhism developed out of the earlier Mahasamkat school, which means great community. Mahayana means great vehicle. As the great vehicle, Mahayana deems other Buddhist schools, including Theravada, as lesser vehicles, which is what the somewhat derogatory term Hinayana Buddhism means. The only school that has lasted among these supposedly lesser vehicles is Theravada. Hence, Theravada is often called Hinayana Buddhism. One major distinguishing feature between Mahayana and Theravada concerns the doctrine of no self. As explained by Eckel, quote, "the Mahayana takes the concept of no self a step further. It denies the reality of a permanent self and the reality of the momentary phenomena that makes up the flow of the personality. This Mahayana position is expressed by saying that everything that is empty of identity, the nature of all things is simply their emptiness. End of quote. Mahayana, therefore, has greater difficulty in answering the question of, and this again is from Eckel, if there is no self, what is reborn? End of quote. The Buddhist, Indian Mahayana philosopher Nagarjuna explains the Mahayana doctrine of emptiness as follows, and I quote, "Whatever is dependently co-arisen, that is explained to be emptiness. That being a dependent designation is itself the middle way. Something that is not dependently arisen, such a thing does not exist, therefore a non-empty thing does not exist." End of quote. Nagarjuna's radical doctrine of emptiness means that if there is no self, even in a momentary causal manner in a stream of reality, then ultimately all differences are but an illusion, including the difference between good or evil, male or female, nirvana and samsara, Buddha and the unawakened. Catholicism, in contrast, asserts that difference does actually exist. The world is different from God, but not in a way that God plus the world is greater than God prior to the creation of the world. This is because the created world only has existence, has being, since it participates without being equal to God who is being. A Buddhist school that follows these assertions to their logical conclusions is the Tantric school. The Tantric school held that, quote, "the wise man renders himself free of impurity by means of impurity itself," end of quote. Some Tantric followers interpret this radical non-dualism, which entails even sexual difference, is but an illusion, by ritualating copulating during meditation as a way of denying difference. This ritual is performed in order to represent in bodily form the Tantric belief that there's no difference between anything. Statues of the Buddha having intercourse with a woman also represents the Tantric belief of radical no difference and non-duality. A principal lesson of these sexual depictions of the Buddha is that ultimately there is nothing to possess or desire, since, as the doctrine of non-duality teaches, the object of our desire is an illusion. This is counter to the thought of Benedict XVI on eros and agape that was discussed in a previous lecture. Catholicism teaches that desirous love exists since there is actual difference in the world with some similarity. This is particularly true in the relationship between human beings and God. God is the ultimate different thou that we desire to possess, and our hearts are restless, as St. Augustine teaches in his Confessions, until our desire rests in obtaining him. To further bring to the fore their radical non-dualism, Tantra Buddhists created statues of the Buddha that instead of looking serene appear filled with wrath and or of passion. And pictured in the transcript are two Tantric bodhisattvas or gods. Mahayana and Tantric Buddhism affirms existence of gods, plural, but never of a creating God as monotheism does. The Mahayana understanding of bodhisattva gods reveals a second significant difference between the Mahayana and Theravada Buddhist traditions. According to Mahayana Buddhism, a person who is about to obtain nirvana but then out of compassion chooses not to is called a bodhisattva, in Sanskrit literally enlightenment being. The term bears with it the additional meaning of a, quote, being intent on achieving enlightenment, end of quote, as explained by Eckel, quote, a bodhisattva aspires to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all other beings. Eventually, even bodhisattvas become Buddhas when their aspiration have reached fruition and their practice of the path is complete. End of quote. And I include a chart in your transcript that identifies the 8 great celestial bodhisattvas that Mahayana Buddhists practice devotions to out of a belief that these compassionate heavenly beings will lead them to being awakened and freed from suffering. Devotion to the bodhisattvas arose about the same time Indians began increasing their worship of Hindu gods. Some scholars maintain that Mahayana Buddhist bodhisattva doctrine was at least partially due to devotion to Hindu gods. The second mentioned difference between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism is seen with great clarity within the Mahayana school of Buddhism called Pure Land. Pure Land Buddhism further developed the Mahayana belief in bodhisattvas who, out of compassionate desire to, quote, attain enlightenment for the sake of all other sentient beings, end of quote, deny themselves nirvana in order to help others on the path to nirvana. This Mahayana understanding of bodhisattvas bears with it the concept of relying on others and not on self to escape suffering and being awakened. Since salvation from suffering can be obtained by relying on the perfections of others, Mahayana also teaches that all are to aspire to be bodhisattvas and to Buddhahood. In contrast, Theravada Buddhists, while also referring to Buddhist bodhisattvas in their tradition, do not hold up bodhisattvas or Buddhahood as the ideal for all to aspire. This explains why Theravada Buddhism did not develop the bodhisattva doctrine as much as the Mahayana did. In Theravada Buddhism, there is such high esteem given to the bodhisattvas and Buddhahood that it is held out as an ideal for a select, exceptional few and not for all. The practical effect of these two different traditions on the role of the bodhisattva is evident in two different ways of understanding dependency, and brings out a third difference between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. In Theravada Buddhism, self-dependency is stressed more. In Mahayana Buddhism, dependence on others is brought to the fore, particularly in Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism promotes reliance on others in order to obtain nirvana with its devotion to Amitabha Buddha. According to a Mahayana story, when Amitabha was but a bodhisattva, he promised that when he obtained Buddhahood, he would create a highly pleasurable place that all could be reborn into as long as they relied on him. All that is required is to remember his name in an undistracted manner. And I read a description of the Pure Land promised by Amitabha. Actually, I think it's best that you read it in the transcript. So in the transcript, there will be an excerpt on the Pure Land promise by Amitabha. Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is named after the land that is situated northeast of India and which borders China. This form of Buddhism is well known in the West mainly because of the immigration of many Tibetans to Western lands in order to be freed of political repression by the government of China. Tibetan Buddhism is a synthesis of Theravada, Mahayana, and Tantric Buddhism. A distinguishing feature of one form of Tibetan Buddhism, called the Yellow Hats, or Virtuous Way, is the belief that their political and spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, is a reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama, who in turn is a reincarnation of the preceding one, and so forth. The current Dalai Lama of the Virtuous Way Buddhism is believed to have been reincarnated 14 times. Since 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama has been living in exile from his homeland. And the current Dalai Lama has offered to be the last of the Dalai Lamas. In explaining this possibility, he states, in the course, and I quote, in the course of upholding the Buddhist tradition in Tibet, we evolved a unique Tibetan tradition of recognizing the reincarnations of scholar adepts that have been of immense help to both the Dharma and sentient beings, particularly to the monastic school. The Dalai Lamas have functioned as both the political and spiritual leaders of Tibet for 369 years since 1642. I have now voluntarily brought this to an end, proud and satisfied that we can pursue the kind of democratic system of government flourishing elsewhere in the world. In fact, as far back as 1969, I made it clear that concerned people should decide whether the Dalai Lama's reincarnation should continue in the future. However, in the absence of clear guidelines, should the concerned public express its strong wish for the Dalai Lama to continue, there's an obvious risk of vested political interests misusing the reincarnation system to fulfill their own political agenda. Therefore, while I remain physically and mentally fit, it seems important to me that we draw up clear guidelines to recognize the next Dalai Lama so that there is no room for doubt or deception. For these guidelines to be fully comprehensible, it is essential to understand the system of tulku recognition and the basic concepts behind it, Therefore, I shall briefly explain them. As I mentioned earlier, reincarnation is a phenomenon which should take place either through the voluntary choice of the concerned person, or at least on the strength of his or her karma, merit, and prayers. Therefore, the person who reincarnates his sole legitimate authority over where and how he or she takes rebirth and how that reincarnation is to be recognized. It is a reality that no one else can force the person concerned or manipulate him or her. It is particularly inappropriate for Chinese communists, who explicitly reject even the idea of past and future lives, let alone the concept of reincarnate tulkus, to meddle in the system of reincarnation and especially the reincarnations of the Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas. Such brazen meddling contradicts their own political ideology and reveals their double standards. Should this situation continue in the future, it will be impossible for Tibetans and those who follow Tibetan Buddhist tradition to acknowledge or accept it. When I'm about 90, I will consult the high lamas of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the Tibetan public, and other concerned people who follow Tibetan Buddhism, and reevaluate whether the institution of the Dalai Lama should continue or not. On that basis, we will take a decision. If it is decided that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama should continue, and there is a need for the 15th Dalai Lama to be recognized, responsibility for doing so will primarily rest on the concerned officers of the Dalai Lama's Gaden Phodrong Trust. They should consult the various heads of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the reliable oath-bound Dharma protectors who are linked inseparably to the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. They should seek advice and direction from these concerned beings and carry out the procedures of search and recognition in accordance with past tradition. I shall leave clear, written instructions about this. Bear in mind that apart from the reincarnation recognized through such legitimate means, no recognition or acceptance should be given to a candidate chosen for political ends by anyone, including those in the People's Republic of China. God bless.